A brittle wind swept across the Blackwood estate, stirring the wild grasses until they bent like supplicants before a storm. At the edge of a gravel drive, Alexander Blackwood stood motionless, his tall frame etched against the grey horizon. He gazed up at the ancestral manor, a fortress of weathered stone and silent windows, every inch of it heavy with the weight of his family's fading fortune. Inside, the corridors whispered with the ghosts of better days, and Alexander, just returned from years in foreign lands, felt the burden of those memories settle on his shoulders like a shroud. He strode up the steps, boots echoing in the marble entrance hall, and paused only when the sharp voice of his mother, the Countess, cut through the hush. Alexander, we cannot delay any longer. Emily's education has suffered enough. The new governess arrives today. See that you greet her properly. Did not answer, his mind tangled with numbers and creditors' faces. But his mother's gaze was as cold and unwavering as the winter rain beyond the windows. With a curt nod, Alexander brushed past her, his coat swirling behind him, and vanished into his study, where ledgers awaited him like old enemies. At that very hour, a modest carriage creaked up the drive. Eleanor Whitmore stepped out, her presence quietly composed beneath a bonnet of dove grey, her gloved hands folded over a single battered valise. The air was sharp with the scent of rain and distant wood smoke. She took in the grandeur of Blackwood Hall, its faded elegance and encroaching ivy, and felt an unfamiliar flutter of anticipation beneath her calm exterior. Mrs. Harrow, the housekeeper, greeted her with brisk efficiency. Miss Whitmore, you are to meet Lady Emily after you have settled in. Her ladyship is particular about punctuality. She led Eleanor through echoing corridors lined with ancestral portraits, stern men and sorrowful women, their eyes seeming to follow her with silent judgment. Eleanor's room was small but tidy, with a view over the mist-laden parkland. She unpacked quickly, her movements precise, betraying nothing of the nervousness she felt. Below, voices murmured in the drawing room, one clipped and masculine, the other, lighter, almost girlish. She descended the stairs just as Emily's laughter rang out, bright and unguarded. The young girl, no more than 12, looked up with curiosity. "Are you the new governess?" she asked. Eleanor inclined her head, her smile gentle. "I am Miss Whitmore. I look forward to our lessons together." Before Emily could reply, Alexander appeared in the doorway, his presence commanding yet distant. His eyes, cold as slate, flickered over Eleanor's modest attire and plain features with the briefest nod. "Miss Whitmore," he said, the words almost a formality. "You will find Lady Emily an apt pupil, if occasionally willful. My mother expects excellence." He turned away without waiting for an answer, leaving only the scent of wet wool and unresolved tension in his wake. Eleanor watched him go, her brow faintly furrowed. She sensed, beneath his reserve, a storm of worry and pride, an entire world that neither Emily nor the Countess seemed able to penetrate. Over the next days, Eleanor observed the household with quiet attention. The way Alexander paced the halls at night, the strain that tightened his jaw when the morning post arrived, the gentle affection he tried to mask for his sister. Emily, for her part, was bright and spirited, eager to learn but quick to test boundaries. "Do you miss your family, Miss Whitmore?" she asked one rainy afternoon, peering up from a Latin primer. Eleanor smiled, her eyes softening. "One always misses what one cannot have, Emily. But sometimes new places bring their own comforts." It was in the quiet spaces between lessons that Eleanor and Alexander crossed paths, on the grand staircase, in the library, beneath the arching boughs of the winter garden. Their exchanges were brief, sometimes little more than a nod or a measured greeting, but in each moment, an unspoken question flickered between them. One evening, as Eleanor lingered in the library, tracing her finger over the spines of battered volumes, she sensed Alexander's presence behind her. He spoke, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "You seem to have settled in quickly, Miss Whitmore." She turned, startled by the note of curiosity in his tone. "It is a comfortable house, my lord, and Lady Emily is a delight." He studied her, searching for something in her calm gaze. "I hope you find your position satisfactory." "My family has seen." Much change. There was a vulnerability in his words that drew Eleanor's attention, and she met his eyes without flinching. Change is never easy, my lord, but sometimes it is the beginning of better things. A flicker of surprise crossed his features, and for the first time, Alexander wondered if he had underestimated the quiet governess. As Eleanor returned to her room that night, her heart beat a little faster. She had glimpsed the true man beneath the Count's austere exterior, and sensed that, for all their differences, their fates might be more entwined than either yet knew. Neither realized that curiosity, once sparked, would soon prove impossible to extinguish. Morning sunlight filtered through the high mullioned windows of Blackwood Hall, drawing golden patterns on the polished floors. In the schoolroom, Eleanor Whitmore sat beside young Emily, their heads bent in concentration over a sheet of music. Emily's small fingers fumbled across the pianoforte keys, producing a hesitant melody that faltered and began again. "Patience, Emily," Eleanor encouraged, her tone warm yet steady. "Allow your hands to remember the shape of the notes. Close your eyes and listen for the music between the sounds." Emily obeyed, her brow furrowed in determination. At last, the tune emerged, halting but sweet, echoing faintly down the corridor. When she finished, Emily looked up, eyes shining with pride. "Miss Whitmore, was it better this time?" Eleanor smiled, genuine affection softening her features. "Much better. You have a keen ear, Emily. With practice, you will play beautifully." The girl beamed, then leaned in with conspiratorial delight. "You make everything seem possible. Mama says you have brought a new spirit to the house." Eleanor's cheeks colored at the compliment. "Your mother is kind, but it is you who have made me feel welcome." Their lessons continued. French conjugations, the poetry of Wordsworth, even a lively discussion on the constellations. It was not long before Emily's laughter echoed through the halls, brighter and more frequent than it had been in many months. Meanwhile, the great house was a tapestry of whispered voices and anxious footsteps. Alexander moved through it with the tension of a man pursued. He spent long hours at his writing desk, head bowed over ledgers, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. When the house was quiet, he rode out to the village for meetings with stern-faced creditors, the lines of worry deepening at his brow with each encounter. One blustery afternoon, Alexander stood outside his study, his voice low and tight, as he spoke to Mr. Griggs, the family solicitor. "The Blackwood lands are not what they once were," Alexander said, gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. "But I will not see my father's name dragged through the mud." Mr. Griggs shuffled his papers. "The creditors grow impatient, my lord. Might I suggest?" Alexander cut him off. "I know what you would suggest, but I will not sell. There must be another way." As Mr. Griggs withdrew, Alexander allowed himself a moment's vulnerability. He pressed his hand to his brow, feeling the weight of generations pressing down, and for an instant envied his sister's laughter drifting from the music room. That evening, the family gathered for dinner in the great hall. The silver gleamed and the candles cast trembling halos on the linen. Eleanor sat at the far end of the table, her posture graceful, her conversation measured. She answered Lady Blackwood's questions with poise, her voice a low, melodious counterpoint to the stiffer tones of the Countess and the exuberance of Emily. Across the table, Alexander found his gaze drawn to her. There was something in the calm way she navigated the conversation, an assurance that seemed almost regal, out of place in one so modestly employed. The line of her jaw, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the subtle refinement of her dress, though plain. It was cut from fabric finer than a governess could usually afford. He watched her as if seeing her for the first time, a small frown creasing his brow. "Is something troubling you, Alexander?" his mother asked, her tone sharp. He glanced away, masking his thoughts. "Only tired, mother. It has been a long day." Eleanor, for her part, felt the weight of Alexander's gaze but kept her composure. Beneath the table, her hands rested on her lap, fingers curled tightly around a folded letter she had received that very morning. A letter sealed in green wax, addressed in an elegant, unfamiliar hand. She had read it in secret, her face unreadable even as her heart thudded with a mixture of dread and hope. Now she guarded it with the quiet ferocity of a woman who knows her secrets are her only protection. In the servants' quarters, speculation about Miss Whitmore's origins grew with each passing day. Cook, polishing a tray of silver, nodded toward the upper floors. Mark my words, that one's not what she seems. Did you see the lace on her collar? And the way she speaks French, like she was born to it. Mrs. Harrow sniffed, her expression severe. We are not paid to gossip. But I will say, I have never seen a governess receive post from London so frequently. The whispers wound their way through the corridors, but Eleanor paid them no mind. She was focused on her duties, on Emily's progress, and on the strange, shifting dynamic with Alexander. The turning point came on a rare, sunlit afternoon. Emily had begged for a lesson in the garden, and Eleanor, always eager to encourage curiosity, agreed. Together, they explored the rose walk, Emily reciting lines of poetry as she skipped ahead. Eleanor paused beneath a flowering arbor, notebook in hand, making notes for the next day's lesson. She did not see the uneven stone beneath her foot until it was too late. Her ankle twisted, and she tumbled forward with a cry, the world spinning in a blur of green and gold. In an instant, strong hands caught her by the arms, steadying her before she could fall further. She looked up, breathless, to find Alexander gazing down at her. For a moment, neither moved. His hands lingered at her waist, their closeness sending a jolt of awareness through them both. Eleanor's bonnet had slipped, and a strand of chestnut hair fell across her cheek. "Are you hurt?" Alexander asked, his voice low and urgent. She tried to stand, but pain shot through her ankle. "It is only a sprain, I think," she managed, mortified by her clumsiness. Without a word, Alexander stooped and lifted her, cradling her against his chest. Eleanor stiffened, her cheeks flaming, but there was no protest in her, only the thudding of her heart and the intoxicating nearness of him. He carried her to a nearby bench, setting her down with unexpected gentleness. He knelt before her, his hands deft as he examined her ankle. Their fingers brushed once, twice, each touch electric in its innocence. Eleanor forced herself to look away, but the memory of his hands on hers lingered, bright and inescapable. "Forgive me," Alexander said, his voice roughened by something he could not name. "I did not mean to startle you." She shook her head, her words barely a whisper. "You did not, thank you, my lord." He hesitated, searching her face for some trace of the thoughts she kept so carefully hidden. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow to that sun-dappled corner of the garden. The hush of wind in the trees, the distant laughter of Emily, and the uncertain promise that trembled between them. When at last Alexander stood, he bowed his head in awkward courtesy. "Take care, Miss Whitmore." He strode away, leaving Eleanor with her pulse racing and her thoughts in tumult. She pressed her hand to her chest, the secret letter still hidden in her bodice, and wondered if the boundaries between them were beginning to crumble. Later, as the sun slipped behind the trees and shadows crept over Blackwood Hall, Eleanor lingered at her window. She traced the lines of the letter with trembling fingers, its mysterious contents burning in her mind. Below, she glimpsed Alexander pacing the lawns, his silhouette stark against the twilight, both of them caught in the silent gravity that now bound their fates. Neither could have guessed how swiftly everything would change, or how a single secret tender and perilous might alter the course of their lives forever. Rain had washed the morning clean, leaving the grounds of Blackwood Hall shining with the promise of festivities. The air inside was thick with anticipation, as footmen polished the banisters and maids hurried with trays of gleaming silver. In the drawing room, Lady Blackwood directed the preparations with the severity of a general on campaign. Flowers in pale spring hues filled the vases, and every lamp was trimmed to a golden glow. It was to be the grandest gathering since Alexander's return, a statement to society that the Blackwoods remained a family of consequence. Eleanor moved quietly through the upper corridors, intent on remaining invisible. She had helped Emily choose her muslin dress and watched from the doorway as the child's hair was arranged in soft curls. Though her duties kept her apart from the guests, she felt the pulse of excitement and anxiety thrumming through the house. The servants whispered as she passed about the carriages lined up outside, the gentlemen from London, the ladies in silks and satins. About Miss Whitmore, too, and what place she might have among such finery. As the hour approached, Eleanor retreated to the schoolroom, her sanctuary. She tried to focus on her correspondence, but the sound of laughter and the strains of a string quartet drifted up the stairs, impossible to ignore. She closed her eyes and pressed a hand to her heart, reminding herself that this world below was not hers. Downstairs, the guests mingled in clusters, their voices rising and falling in waves of practiced civility. Alexander wore the formal black of a host, his posture stiff with duty, his eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of pride and apprehension. He exchanged pleasantries, raised glasses, and forced smiles, all while feeling the constraints of expectation settle like a yoke around his neck. "Your guests are most distinguished tonight," remarked Sir Geoffrey, a family friend, with a nod toward the cluster of gentlemen near the hearth. Alexander managed a polite reply. "We are fortunate to have such company." Blackwood Hall has missed the sound of celebration. Ah, but it is not the hall that brings life to the party, but its host. Sir Geoffrey's eyes twinkled with mischief. "And what of your mysterious new governess? I have heard she is quite accomplished." Alexander's gaze flickered, betraying a moment's surprise. "Miss Whitmore is devoted to her duties. She prefers to keep to herself." On the opposite side of the room, Lady Blackwood's attention was also fixed on her son, and on the subtle currents that swirled around the governess, even in her absence. She noted the glances exchanged by the younger guests, the questions whispered behind gloved hands. Something about Eleanor unsettled her, though she could not yet put a name to her suspicions. The evening deepened. The music grew livelier and laughter spilled into the corridors. It was Emily, flushed with excitement, who slipped away from the crowd and found Eleanor in the schoolroom. "Miss Whitmore, you must come downstairs," she begged, tugging at Eleanor's sleeve. "Mamma says I may have my governess with me for a little while. Please, only for a moment. It is dreadfully dull without you." Eleanor hesitated, torn between her station and her affection for the child. Before she could protest, Emily seized her hand and led her down the grand staircase, her delight impossible to resist. The drawing room fell briefly silent as the pair entered, heads turned. Eleanor felt the burn of 100 eyes upon her. She kept her chin high, her demeanor serene, but inside her heart hammered with nerves. Lady Blackwood's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Emily guided Eleanor to a seat beside the pianoforte, chattering with innocent enthusiasm. "Miss Whitmore plays beautifully," she announced to no one in particular. "She taught me the nocturne I played for you last week, Mamma." An older gentleman, Lord Linley, overheard and smiled indulgently. "Is that so? Then we must persuade Miss Whitmore to favor us with a piece." Lady Blackwood intervened, her tone cool. "Miss Whitmore is here in a professional capacity. She would not wish to intrude upon our guests." But Emily persisted, and the assembled company, sensing a harmless diversion, began to murmur their encouragement. Eleanor looked to Alexander, uncertain. His eyes met hers across the crowded room, steady, searching, as if willing her to accept. Something in his gaze gave her courage. "If it would please the company," Eleanor said, her voice composed, "I shall be glad to oblige." She seated herself at the pianoforte, hands trembling only slightly as she arranged her skirts. The room hushed. She paused a moment, drawing a breath, then let her fingers fall upon the keys. The first notes spilled into the air, clear, lyrical, and impossibly tender. She played a nocturne of Chopin, the melody weaving through the room like a spell. Her posture was perfect, her touch both passionate and restrained. The music gathered the attention of every guest, drawing them into a hush of collective wonder. Even the servants at the door leaned in, entranced. Alexander watched her, his heart caught between pride and astonishment. He had known she was educated, her command of French, her gentle correction of Emily's grammar, but this was something else. There was a nobility in her bearing, a refined artistry that seemed to speak of another world. He saw the way her lashes fluttered, the grace of her hands, the emotion that colored every phrase. When the last chord faded, the silence lingered, fragile and electric. Then came applause, gentle at first, then swelling as the guests found their voices. Lady Blackwood's eyes narrowed, her suspicions sharpening. "Remarkable," she said softly, her gaze fixed on Eleanor with a new calculating intensity. Lord Linley approached, offering a courtly bow. Miss Whitmore, you play with the soul of a true artist. I would wager you have had the finest instruction. Eleanor inclined her head, careful to reveal nothing. I have been fortunate, my lord, to have known good teachers. Emily threw her arms around Eleanor, beaming with pride. I told you she was wonderful. The guests resumed their conversation, but now the undercurrent was different. Eleanor's performance had unsettled the careful hierarchies of the room. Whispers followed her as she excused herself, returning to the safety of the shadows. Alexander caught up to her in the corridor, away from prying eyes. He spoke quietly, his voice stripped of formality. You never told me you played so well. Eleanor looked down, her composure wavering. It is not something I often share, my lord. The world seldom asks for more from a governess than diligence and discretion. He studied her, his expression softening. You have reminded me tonight that there is more to life than duty, more, perhaps, than I have allowed myself to remember. A silence stretched between them, weighted with words unspoken. Eleanor felt the pull of his presence, the dangerous warmth that threatened her careful boundaries. It is not always easy to know one's place, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander's eyes darkened, searching hers, nor to accept it when the heart would choose otherwise. Their gazes locked intense, searching, charged with all the longing and uncertainty that propriety forbade. In that silent exchange, the world seemed to fall away. The guests, the obligations, the secrets they both harbored. For a fleeting moment, Eleanor let herself believe in the possibility of something more. Then footsteps approached, shattering the spell. Eleanor stepped back, her mask restored. Thank you for the music, Miss Whitmore, Alexander said, returning to formality, but the depth in his eyes lingered. As she slipped away into the quiet of the upper halls, Eleanor's mind and heart warred within her. Duty and longing, fear and hope. Each step carried her further into a labyrinth from which there might be no escape. Lady Blackwood watched from the doorway, suspicion deepening. In the wake of the music, something irreparable had shifted. And in the hush that followed, both Eleanor and Alexander knew that nothing between them could ever be the same. A restless wind stirred the trees that lined the Blackwood estate, carrying the first hints of spring across the rolling fields. Beneath the wide, pale sky, Eleanor walked at a measured pace along the path that curved through the gardens. Her gloved hands clasped a leather-bound volume of Shakespeare to her chest, and her eyes, bright, thoughtful, lingered on the emerging buds and the world coming slowly awake after winter's silence. It was on these walks that Alexander began to join her, at first by chance and then by design. The days following the fete had changed something between them, drawing them together in small, inexorable steps. Their conversations began with polite exchanges, a comment on the weather, a shared observation about Emily's progress, but soon deepened, weaving threads of literature and art through the fabric of their days. One morning, as sunlight dappled the gravel path, Alexander appeared at Eleanor's side, his stride matching hers. He wore no cravat and his coat was unbuttoned, a rare informality that made him seem younger, almost boyish. Miss Whitmore, he said, inclining his head, I see you have rescued Hamlet from the library's dust. She smiled, her expression wry. I find the prince's melancholy very much at home in these English gardens. He gave a soft laugh, surprising her. Do you pity him or admire him? Perhaps a little of both, she replied, glancing up at him. He is honest in his doubts, though they paralyze him. They walked on, the words flowing between them with new ease. They spoke of poetry, Wordsworth, Byron, and the wit of Jane Austen. Alexander confessed to a fondness for Turner's stormy landscapes, while Eleanor described a painting she had once seen in Paris, her voice colored with nostalgia and longing. He listened, intrigued. You speak as if you have traveled much. Eleanor hesitated, the ghost of caution flickering in her eyes. A governess's life is seldom settled, my lord. One learns to adapt. He accepted this with a nod, though her reticence only deepened his curiosity. Their steps slowed as they reached a sundial half hidden by ivy. Alexander paused, tracing the weathered stone with a finger. My mother says I spend too much time brooding over the past, he said. Yet I find the present increasingly Complicated. Eleanor's heart skipped at his candor. Complicated things are often the most worth understanding. He looked at her then, the space between them charged with attention neither could name. She felt it in the way his gaze lingered on her mouth, in the slight tremor of her own hand. But even as their closeness grew, each felt the pull of invisible chains. Alexander's were forged of duty and pride, the legacy he must restore, the name he must uphold. Eleanor's were darker, more elusive, the secret she had carried into Blackwood Hall, and the growing fear that it would one day destroy all hope of happiness. Rumor was quick to follow the change in their manner. The servants gossiped in the scullery, and behind half-closed doors. "I saw his lordship walking with her again," whispered Jenny, the housemaid. "They were talking of poetry, if you please, as if she were a lady." Cook snorted, kneading dough with ferocity. "Mark my words, there's more to that Miss Whitmore than meets the eye. And now Lord Hastings is sniffing about. That'll put the cat among the pigeons." Indeed, Lord Hastings, a neighbor of considerable wealth and charm, had recently taken to calling at Blackwood Hall with unusual frequency. He was several years older than Alexander, with a smile that seemed always on the verge of laughter. On one such afternoon, the household was thrown into a flutter by his arrival. Lady Blackwood received him in the drawing-room, where Eleanor had brought Emily for her daily reading. Lord Hastings greeted the girl with easy warmth, but it was Eleanor who drew his attention. "Miss Whitmore, I have heard much of your talents," he said, his eyes alight with admiration. "Perhaps you might favor us with your opinion of Tennyson's latest verses? I confess I find them rather overwrought." Eleanor answered with composure. "Tennyson's melancholy has its place, my lord, though I suspect he would benefit from a little sunlight." Lord Hastings laughed, delighted. "A sound prescription, Miss Whitmore. I wonder, might I tempt you and Lady Emily to join us on a walk tomorrow? The daffodils at my estate are in bloom." Lady Blackwood's approval was immediate. "How thoughtful, Lord Hastings." "I'm certain Emily would be charmed." Eleanor inclined her head, masking her discomfort. "We would be honored, my lord." Alexander, entering at that moment, stiffened at the sight of Lord Hastings' easy manner. Their eyes met across the room, a brief, silent clash. Lord Hastings smiled, oblivious to the tension. "Blackwood, you must lend us your expertise on the best paths through the woods, unless you are too busy with your accounts." Alexander's reply was cool. "I make time for what matters, Hastings. You will find the western path most agreeable." The walk the next day was bright with birdsong and the scent of damp earth. Lord Hastings escorted Eleanor and Emily through his gardens, his conversation lively and attentive. He asked Eleanor about her travels, her favorite poets, her views on education. She answered politely, but kept her guard up, aware of Alexander's presence a few paces behind, his silence growing heavier with every step. At one point, Lord Hastings offered Eleanor his arm to cross a muddy patch. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. Alexander's eyes were fixed on her, unreadable. "Thank you, my lord," Eleanor said, accepting Hastings' arm with a graceful nod. The gesture was innocent, but the effect on Alexander was unmistakable. He strode ahead, jaw clenched, the tension in his posture obvious to anyone who cared to look. Later, as they returned to Blackwood Hall, Emily chattered about the flowers and the picnic Lord Hastings had promised. Lady Blackwood looked on with satisfaction, already imagining the advantages of a closer connection to their illustrious neighbor. In the days that followed, Lord Hastings' attentions continued, always courteous, never improper, but marked by a growing intimacy that did not escape the notice of the household. Alexander became withdrawn, his conversation more guarded, his manner with Eleanor oscillating between cool reserve and flashes of barely controlled feeling. One afternoon, as Eleanor arranged wildflowers in a vase, Alexander entered the room and closed the door behind him. "Miss Whitmore," he began, voice low, "may I speak with you?" She set the vase down, her pulse quickening. "Of course, my lord." He hesitated, searching her face. "I wish to apologize for my manner during our walk with Lord Hastings. It was ungracious." Eleanor met his gaze, steady and calm. "There is nothing to forgive." He stepped closer, the air charged between them. "I find myself at a loss, Miss Whitmore. You have become important to us, to Emily, to me." Eleanor's breath caught and she looked away. "We must be careful, my lord." The world is not kind to those who forget their place. He reached out, then stopped himself, his hand falling to his side. Sometimes I wish I could forget. She smiled, a little sadly. Wishing is dangerous, Alexander. He looked at her, longing and frustration etched in every line of his face. And yet I cannot help myself. The moment hung, delicate as glass. Then the sound of footsteps in the corridor broke the spell, and Alexander stepped back, his composure returning. After he left, Eleanor stood for a long moment, fighting the ache in her chest. She was drawn to him, impossibly, irrevocably, but every step closer was a step toward disaster. That evening, as the house settled into quiet, Eleanor retired to her room. She found a letter waiting for her on the writing desk, sealed in the same green wax as before. Her hands trembled as she broke it open. The message was brief, the handwriting unfamiliar but urgent. You are not as hidden as you believe. They are asking questions in London. Take care, there are eyes upon you at Blackwood Hall. Eleanor pressed the letter to her lips, her mind racing. Fear and longing warred within her. She thought of Alexander, of the impossible hope that had begun to grow in her heart, and of the threat now looming over them both. Downstairs, in the dim light of the library, Alexander sat alone, a book open but unread in his lap. He stared into the fire, haunted by the memory of Eleanor's voice and the feeling of her presence beside him. Duty, jealousy, desire, all tangled together, binding him to a fate he was no longer sure he could command. The days that followed brought more whispered rumors, more knowing looks from the servants. Eleanor moved through the halls with studied composure, but every shadow seemed to hold a threat. She clung to her routines, lessons with Emily, walks in the garden, stolen moments of music, but the sense of safety she had found at Blackwood Hall was slipping away. Lord Hastings' visits became more frequent. He brought gifts for Emily, books for Eleanor, always with a word of praise and an easy smile. Lady Blackwood watched him with approval, her hopes for an advantageous match growing with each passing day. But Alexander grew only more restless. He sought out Eleanor whenever he could, finding pretexts for conversation, a passage of poetry, a question about Emily's lessons. Their exchanges were charged with meaning, every word a battleground between longing and restraint. One morning, as Eleanor read aloud to Emily beneath the spreading branches of a willow, Alexander approached. His voice was gentle but strained. Emily, I believe Cook has baked your favorite seed cake. Would you fetch us some and perhaps some tea? Emily grinned and ran off, leaving Eleanor and Alexander alone. He sat beside her on the grass, his eyes fixed on the water's shimmering surface. Miss Whitmore. Eleanor, I must ask, are you truly happy here? She looked at him, her heart in her throat. I am grateful for your kindness, my lord, and for Emily's affection, but happiness. She broke off, unable to finish. He turned to her, his face open, vulnerable. If there is anything I might do. Eleanor shook her head, tears pricking her eyes. There is nothing you can do. Some things cannot be changed. He reached for her hand, just as Emily's voice called from the house. They sprang apart, the moment lost. That night, Eleanor lay awake, the warning letter beneath her pillow. She could no longer ignore the danger closing in on her. Her feelings for Alexander had grown too strong, her secret too perilous. Every glance, every touch, every word between them seemed to draw her closer to the edge of a precipice. In the dark, she made a silent vow. Whatever the cost, she would not allow her past to endanger those she had come to care for, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. But as dawn crept over the horizon, Eleanor knew that neither love nor danger would wait for her to decide. The walls of Blackwood Hall held secrets enough for both of them, and the time would soon come when all must be revealed. Thunderclouds gathered above Blackwood Hall, casting the estate in somber shadow. The air in the drawing room was taut with unspoken dread. A single sheet of crumpled newsprint lay abandoned on a polished table, its bold headline pronouncing scandal for all who dared to read. Blackwood legacy in jeopardy, rumors of lost inheritance. Alexander stood at the window, fists clenched, as he stared at the approaching storm. Each drop of rain against the glass sounded like a ticking clock. The news had spread through the county with merciless speed, and now it seemed every neighbor and creditor waited to see if the Blackwoods would fall. In the weeks following the first whispers, Alexander became a changed man. He was rarely seen outside his study, his face drawn and eyes rimmed with sleepless worry. Account books and legal documents littered his desk, but none offered hope. The once proud estate was on the brink of ruin, and the pressure of generations weighed heavier than ever. Eleanor watched him from afar, her heart aching. She saw how Emily's laughter had faded, how the servants moved with anxious restraint, how Lady Blackwood's temper grew brittle as glass. She longed to offer comfort, but the boundaries between them had become walls impenetrable, cold, and necessary. One evening after dinner, Eleanor found Alexander pacing the corridor outside the library. He barely looked at her as she passed, but the rawness in his voice stopped her. "My father was a fool," he muttered as if to himself, "to gamble everything on a promise, and now I must pay." Eleanor summoned her courage, her voice gentle. "Perhaps not all is lost, my lord. Sometimes secrets are kept for protection, not destruction." He met her gaze, pain etched deep. "What would you know of secrets, Miss Whitmore?" Her answer was a mere whisper, more than you might imagine. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor wandered the house. The silence pressed in on her, broken only by the distant ticking of a grandfather clock. Something in Alexander's despair compelled her to act. If there was any way to help, she must find it. She slipped into the library, lighting a candle. The air was thick with dust and memory. She moved quietly, searching the shelves and drawers, her hands trembling as she sifted through brittle correspondence and ledgers yellowed with age. In a box marked with the Blackwood crest, she found a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, and beneath them, a sheaf of legal documents stamped with the seal of a London barrister. Heart pounding, Eleanor pored over the pages, piecing together the history of the estate. A name recurred: Sir Edmund Blackwood, Alexander's great-uncle, thought lost at sea decades before. And there, in a codicil written in a neat, slanting hand, she found mention of a secondary trust, to be held in confidence until such time as my rightful heir should come of age and lay claim, by proof of birth and character. Eleanor's mind raced. Could this be the inheritance the papers spoke of? If so, it had never been properly claimed, perhaps overlooked in the chaos after Sir Edmund's death. She copied the relevant passages and returned the documents, her hands shaking with hope and fear. The next day, as the household buzzed with anxious speculation, Eleanor sought a private audience with Alexander. She found him in the morning room, hunched over a cold cup of tea, his eyes shadowed. "My lord," she began, her tone urgent, "may I speak with you privately?" He looked up, surprise flickering in his expression. "Of course." She handed him the copied passages, explaining what she had discovered. As he read, disbelief warred with cautious hope in his eyes. "If this is true," he murmured, "there may yet be a way to save Blackwood Hall." Eleanor nodded. "You must contact your family solicitor at once. The trust may have been overlooked, but if you can prove your claim." He stood, hope igniting for the first time in weeks. "Miss Whitmore, I do not know how to thank you." She offered a small, uncertain smile. "If it helps Emily and your family, that is thanks enough." But their moment of shared relief was short-lived. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface now erupted elsewhere. Lady Blackwood, having heard whispers of Eleanor's unusual education and composure, summoned her to the withdrawing room that afternoon. Eleanor entered with measured calm, but her heart thundered in her chest. Lady Blackwood stood by the mantel, her bearing regal, eyes sharp as a hawk's. "Miss Whitmore, I have tolerated much in the name of my daughter's happiness and my son's peace," she began, her voice icy. "But I must have the truth. Where did you acquire such education? Your manners and accomplishments are not those of a simple governess." Eleanor's mind spun. She chose her words with care. "My upbringing was unorthodox, my lady. My father believed a woman should be prepared for all of life's challenges." Lady Blackwood's gaze narrowed. Your father? And who was he that he could afford tutors worthy of a countess? Eleanor held her ground. He was a man of principle, if not of fortune. I have never claimed to be more than I am, a woman seeking honest employment. For a long moment, Lady Blackwood studied her, suspicion mingling with grudging respect. Be warned, Miss Whitmore. Blackwood Hall is not the place for secrets. Should I learn you have deceived us, you will be sent away at once. I understand, my lady. Dismissed, Eleanor retreated to her room, her composure cracking. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass of the window, watching the rain streak down the panes. She knew she had evaded disaster barely, but her time at Blackwood Hall was nearing its end. Sooner or later, the truth would out, and she would be forced to leave behind everything she had come to cherish. Meanwhile, Alexander threw himself into the investigation of the trust, corresponding feverishly with the family solicitor and searching for proof of his rightful claim. His hope was tinged with desperation, and the strain showed in his every word and gesture. The distance between Alexander and Eleanor grew by the day. Their conversations became formal, stripped of warmth. They passed in the hallways like strangers, each weighed down by secrets and regrets. Emily sensed the change and grew sullen, clinging to Eleanor with quiet desperation. One evening, as Eleanor walked the garden alone, Alexander found her beneath the bare branches of the old elm. "Miss Whitmore," he said, voice rough, "why must you always be so distant?" She turned, pain flickering in her eyes. "It is better this way, my lord, for your family and for me." He stepped closer, struggling to contain his emotion. "You have given me hope when I had none, and yet you keep yourself locked away." She looked away, blinking back tears. "I must." He hesitated, then bowed his head. "If you ever need anything, I hope you will tell me." Eleanor watched him go, her heart breaking. The cold wind carried away his words, leaving only silence. Inside, the servants whispered more fiercely than ever. Some said the governess would soon be dismissed. Others wondered if she was the key to the Blackwoods' salvation. Eleanor ignored them all, pouring her energy into Emily's lessons and her own quiet search for closure. In the days that followed, the outcome of the inheritance remained uncertain. The future of Blackwood Hall hung in the balance, and with it, the fate of everyone within its walls. Eleanor braced herself for the inevitable end, knowing that the cost of her secrets and her heart might soon be more than she could bear. Yet even as hope flickered on the horizon, Eleanor sensed that the true test was still to come. The storm had not yet passed, and the hardest decisions lay ahead. The night air was thick with anticipation as the carriage rattled down the cobbled streets toward the city. Inside, Eleanor sat beside Emily, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the flickering lantern light casting shifting shadows across her pale face. The invitation to the spring ball had come as a surprise Lady Blackwood's way, perhaps of both rewarding and testing her. The city's grand assembly rooms promised an evening of splendor, but for Eleanor, each mile from Blackwood Hall felt like a step toward a precipice she had long tried to avoid. Emily, radiant in her first silk gown, could scarcely contain her excitement. "Will there be waltzes, Miss Whitmore? And do you think Lord Hastings will ask me to dance?" Eleanor managed a smile. "You are sure to have every dance card filled, Emily. Remember your curtsy, and do not let the gentleman spin you too quickly." The city glowed with 1,000 lamps, and inside the assembly rooms, the scene was dazzling. Crystal chandeliers scattered light like diamonds over swirling gowns and the sheen of polished boots. Music soared above the hum of conversation, and the air was fragrant with roses and anticipation. The Blackwoods arrived in a flurry of introductions and curtsies. Lady Blackwood regal, Alexander stern and distracted, Emily wide-eyed with wonder. At first, Eleanor kept to the periphery, content to watch over Emily as she was swept into the circle of local gentry. She exchanged polite greetings with the other chaperones, her bearing gracious but reserved, careful not to draw notice. Alexander hovered at a distance, his gaze often drawn to her, even as duty called him to mingle with guests and exchange stiff words with creditors and rivals alike. As the evening wore on, Emily, cheeks flushed with excitement, returned to Eleanor's side. "Please, Miss Whitmore, won't you dance just once? Everyone is watching, and you look so lovely tonight." Before Eleanor could respond, a familiar voice sliced through the music and laughter. Miss Whitmore, by heavens, is it truly you? She froze. Turning, she saw a tall, gray-haired gentleman making his way through the crowd, his eyes alight with delighted recognition. He bowed deeply. Forgive my boldness, but I never imagined I should meet the heiress of Whitmore Hall at such a gathering. The words fell like stones into a still pond. Conversation faltered around them. Eyes turned, curious and expectant. Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears. The gentleman offered his hand. Ashcroft, my dear Charles Ashcroft, your father and I corresponded for many years. You must allow me to pay my respects to your family's legacy. Eleanor's lips parted, but her voice failed her. She felt the room closing in, the warmth of the lamps suddenly stifling. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Alexander approaching, his face drained of color. Miss Whitmore? He began, uncertainty and disbelief warring in his tone. Ashcroft beamed, oblivious to the tension. I was just telling your charming charge here that her governess is none other than Eleanor Whitmore, heiress of Whitmore Hall. Your father would be proud. Your family's estate is the envy of half the county. A hush settled around them. Eleanor felt every gaze like a brand. For a moment, she wished only to flee, to vanish from the gilded room and the trap closing around her. Alexander's eyes met hers, searching, wounded. Is it true? He asked, his voice barely audible above the music. You are... She drew a shaky breath, summoning all her composure. It is true, my lord, she said softly, her words carrying further than she intended. I am Eleanor Whitmore. My family, my inheritance, are not what I have pretended them to be. He stepped back, as if struck. Why? The word was raw, broken. Why conceal such a thing? Eleanor's cheeks burned. Ashcroft, realizing at last the delicacy of the situation, bowed again and retreated with murmured apologies, leaving them surrounded by a fragile ring of silence. She forced herself to meet Alexander's eyes. Because I had no choice. Because the name Whitmore is a curse to your family. Our fathers were enemies, yours lost lands and honor in the courts to mine. I came to Blackwood Hall seeking anonymity, not malice. I never wished to bring more misfortune upon you. His jaw tightened, pain and anger flickering across his features. You let me believe you were one of us, a woman of no consequence, no fortune. All the while you... She shook her head, tears threatening. I wished only to be useful, to earn my place through merit, not birth. I feared what would happen if the truth emerged that you would despise me, that Lady Blackwood would send me away, that Emily would lose her friend. Alexander's voice dropped, trembling with emotion. Did you think so little of me? That I could not separate the sins of the father from the woman before me? A waltz began, the strains of the orchestra mocking the storm between them. Eleanor felt exposed, the years of careful secrecy unraveling in a single terrible moment. She glanced at Emily, who hovered uncertainly at her side, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Emily, Eleanor whispered, kneeling to take the girl's hands. I'm so sorry. I never wished to deceive you. Emily flung her arms around Eleanor's neck. I do not care who you are. You are my dearest friend. The girl's words were balm and torment at once. Eleanor straightened, composing herself as best she could. Alexander's expression softened, but the hurt remained. You must understand what this means, Eleanor. If your family presses its claim, Blackwood Hall will be lost. Everything I have fought for. She cut in, her voice trembling. I have no interest in old quarrels or estates. My inheritance means nothing to me. Nothing compared to what I have found here. He looked away, jaw working. And yet, it cannot be ignored. You are an heiress, and I, a man of honor, she finished gently. You will do what you must for your family. I understand. A pause stretched between them, charged with all they could not say. Around them, the ball resumed its whirl, the incident already transforming into rumor and speculation among the guests. Lady Blackwood appeared at Alexander's elbow, her face pale but composed. What has happened? Why are people staring? Alexander answered in a low, harsh whisper. Miss Whitmore is not who she claimed to be. Eleanor met Lady Blackwood's gaze, lifting her chin in quiet defiance. I am sorry for the deception, my lady. It was never my intention to cause harm. The Countess studied her, suspicion and calculation warring in her eyes. "We will discuss this at home." Eleanor nodded, accepting her fate. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Eleanor kept to the shadows, enduring the curious stares and whispered speculation. Emily refused to leave her side, offering comfort with the stubborn loyalty only a child could muster. The carriage ride home was silent. Lady Blackwood stared straight ahead, lips pressed in a thin line. Alexander gazed out the window, lost in thought, while Emily clung to Eleanor's hand. When they reached Blackwood Hall, Eleanor turned to Emily at the door. "Go to bed, dearest. I will come to you soon." Emily hesitated, then obeyed, leaving Eleanor alone in the echoing hall. She braced herself as Alexander and his mother approached. Lady Blackwood spoke first, her voice icy but controlled. "You will explain everything, Miss Whitmore. No more evasions." Eleanor did not flinch. "My father was Charles Whitmore of Whitmore Hall. After his death, I inherited the estate. The legal disputes between our families are well known," Lady Blackwood interrupted. "And you thought to play governess here under my roof?" "I needed refuge. I wanted to be of use. I never intended for anyone to know." Alexander's voice was quiet, but each word cut deep. "You have placed us in an impossible position. If your trustees press their claim, everything we have left could be lost." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "I will do nothing to harm Blackwood Hall. Whatever the law may allow, I will not pursue it." Lady Blackwood's expression softened, just perceptibly. "Intentions are one thing, Miss Whitmore. The world does not always care for them." A heavy silence fell. At last, Lady Blackwood turned away, signaling the end of the interview. Alexander lingered, searching Eleanor's face for something: hope, forgiveness, or perhaps a reason to believe in a future now threatened by old enmities and cruel circumstance. "I do not know what to do," he confessed. "I do not know if I can forgive you, and yet—" She swallowed hard. "Nor do I know how to undo what has been done. But I swear, Alexander, I never meant to hurt you." He nodded, then turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor alone in the vast, silent hall. The night was deep and cold. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room, every step heavier than the last. She knew her secret had shattered the fragile happiness she had found at Blackwood Hall, and that nothing would ever be the same. Yet even as despair threatened, a stubborn ember of hope flickered within her. The truth was out, and the consequences would be grave. But perhaps, just perhaps, the end of deception could be the beginning of something new. In the darkness, as Blackwood Hall slept uneasy, Eleanor resolved to face whatever trials awaited her with courage and with love, no matter the cost. Dawn crept over Blackwood Hall with a pale, merciless light, revealing a house changed overnight. The ball in the city was already a distant memory, replaced by the cold aftermath of revelation. In the hush before breakfast, Eleanor lingered at her window, her valise half packed, her heart fractured. The truth of her identity, the one secret she had sworn to guard, had burst forth in the most public, ruinous fashion. There was no going back. Downstairs, the silence was leaden. Alexander had not slept. He paced the library, his face drawn and shadowed, the sting of betrayal sharp as a blade. He replayed the events of the night: Ashcroft's careless greeting, the shocked whispers, Eleanor's confession. Rage and humiliation twisted inside him. She had walked his halls, shared his burdens, and all the while, she had been the Whitmore heiress, the very name that had haunted Blackwood fortunes for a generation. Lady Blackwood moved with rigid composure, her expression carved from granite. She summoned Eleanor to the drawing room as soon as the household had roused. Eleanor entered, pale but upright, her eyes clear despite the tears she had shed in solitude. "You must leave this house," Lady Blackwood declared before Eleanor could speak. "Today. There is no place for you here, not after this deception." Eleanor bowed her head. "I understand, my lady. I did not intend to deceive you, or anyone. I only wished to spy, perhaps, to gather information for your family's next claim." The Countess's voice was ice. "No," Eleanor insisted, voice trembling. "I ran from Whitmore Hall because I could not bear the pressure. The constant suitors, the talk of alliances, the expectations that I should marry for wealth, not affection. Here I found peace, and a purpose that was my own. I never meant harm. Lady Blackwood was unmoved. Intentions are meaningless now. My son's reputation is in tatters. The servants gossip, the neighbors gloat. Your presence here has brought nothing but scandal. Eleanor bit her lip, forcing back tears. Let me at least say goodbye to Emily. The Countess's lips pressed into a thin line. If you must, but make it swift. Eleanor hurried upstairs, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She found Emily in the schoolroom, surrounded by the remnants of the life they had shared. Books, music, a half-finished drawing of the garden. At the sight of Eleanor, Emily ran to her, flinging her arms around her waist. Must you go? Emily's voice was small, trembling. Mama says you are not coming back. Eleanor knelt, gathering Emily close. I must, dearest. But you are so brave and so clever, you will do well. Remember everything we learned together. I will never forget you. Tears streamed down Emily's cheeks. Promise you will write? Eleanor pressed a kiss to her brow. I promise with all my heart. And you must promise to keep playing the pianoforte and to be kind to your brother, even when he is cross. Emily clung to her, sobbing, until Mrs. Harrow appeared in the doorway, her own eyes suspiciously bright. Eleanor stood, smoothing Emily's hair one last time. Goodbye, my darling girl. She left quickly, unable to bear another moment. In her room, she gathered the last of her things. Every object was a memory. The worn copy of Wordsworth, the scarf Emily had knitted, the pressed violets from the garden. She placed them carefully in her case, her hands trembling. Alexander found her in the corridor as she descended, her valise in hand. He stood rigid, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burned with accusation. Going so soon, Miss Whitmore. Or should I say, Lady Whitmore. She flinched at the formality, at the bitterness in his voice. Alexander, please let me explain. I never came here to harm you. I needed to escape. Escape what? He cut in sharply. A life of luxury? An estate twice the size of Blackwood. You played the martyr well, but do not think for a moment I do not see the truth. You came to spy, to judge, perhaps to finish what your father began. Eleanor's voice shook. That is not fair. I did not choose to be born a Whitmore. I only wanted peace, a chance to be myself, not some prize to be won by men who cared nothing for me. He laughed, harsh and cold. So you chose to deceive us all instead? To worm your way into our trust? Into Emily's heart, into mine? Her composure broke. I never meant to deceive you. I tried to tell you so many times, but I was afraid of losing everything that mattered to me. Alexander's jaw tightened. You should have trusted me, Eleanor, but you did not. You let me believe you were my equal, when all the while you held the power to ruin me. She looked at him, tears spilling down her cheeks. I never wanted that power. I would give it all up if I could. He turned away, wounded pride and love warring in his expression. It is too late for that. She moved as if to reach for him, then stopped, her hand falling to her side. Goodbye, Alexander. He did not answer. She left him standing there, the space between them wide as an ocean. Downstairs, the servants gathered discreetly, some offering sympathetic glances, others whispering behind their hands. Mrs. Harrow pressed a small packet of cakes into Eleanor's palm, her voice rough. You were good to the girl. We will miss you. Eleanor managed a wan smile. Thank you. Be kind to Emily. She walked out into the morning, the sky heavy with the threat of rain. Her carriage awaited at the gates. As she climbed in, she looked back at the house, her home, for a fleeting, precious time. She saw Emily at an upper window, waving desperately, and lifted her hand in farewell. Inside, Alexander stood at the window of his study, watching the carriage roll away. Anger, shame, and a terrible ache twisted within him. He remembered Eleanor's laughter, her gentle wisdom, the light she had brought to the darkest corners of Blackwood Hall. And now she was gone, by his command, by his mother's, by the dictates of pride and wounded trust. He shut himself in, refusing all comfort, haunted by the thought that he had been a fool first to trust her, then to drive her away. The name Whitmore echoed through his mind, tangled with memories of loss, rivalry, and now, longing. He told himself she had used him, that she had come to Blackwood Hall with secrets and intentions he could never forgive. Yet in the quiet, when the house grew still and the storm finally broke, Alexander found no peace in anger, only emptiness and a question that would not let him rest. Had he lost the only woman who had ever truly seen him? As the rain swept across the fields, Eleanor's carriage disappeared down the long, winding road. The future loomed uncertain, every hope hanging by the slenderest thread. But neither Eleanor nor Alexander could know that the story of Blackwood and Whitmore was far from over, and that fate, with all its cruelties and mercies, was not yet finished with them. Rain lashed the grand windows of Whitmore Hall, veiling the countryside in a grey shroud. Inside, Eleanor moved through corridors that were vast and echoing, her every step accompanied by the hushed admonitions of her guardians. The portraits of her ancestors seemed to glare down in judgment as she passed, their expectations pressing upon her with a weight she had never before felt so keenly. The days since her return had unfolded in a relentless pattern of duty and disappointment. Her tutors, Mr. Fairfax, stern and pragmatic, and Mrs. Harrow, returned now to Whitmore Hall in a new capacity, pressed upon her the necessity of a prudent match. And who more prudent than Lord Hastings, with his impeccable lineage and ambitions so perfectly aligned with the fortune and influence of the Whitmore estate? "You must see reason, Eleanor," Mr. Fairfax intoned one morning as she sat rigid in her father's old study. "With the Blackwood scandal in the papers, your position is precarious. Lord Hastings offers respectability, security, and the consolidation of your family's lands. You cannot afford to delay." Eleanor's reply was soft but unyielding. "I will not marry a man I do not love." Mrs. Harrow's voice was gentler but no less insistent. "My dear, a woman in your station has little choice. You have always been dutiful. Now you must be wise." Eleanor offered no answer. Her heart, battered and sore, was far away haunted by memories of Blackwood Hall, Emily's laughter, the golden quiet of the garden, Alexander's eyes, bright with pride or shadowed by pain. Each day, she wandered Whitmore's endless rooms, longing for the peace and purpose she had once found as a simple governess. Lord Hastings visited often, his courtship careful but persistent. He brought bouquets of white lilies, rare books, and news of the county. When he spoke, it was always of the future. Alliances, investments, improvements to the estate, never once of love or longing. "I am honored to be received, Miss Whitmore," he said on one such occasion, his smile practiced. "I trust your time at Blackwood was not too unpleasant, despite the unfortunate conclusion." Eleanor managed civility. "I learned much from my time there, but I am content to be home." He pressed her gently but firmly. "The world is watching, Eleanor. A union between our families would silence many tongues and benefit us both." She bowed her head, offering no promise. Each night she sat alone at her pianoforte, her fingers wandering listlessly over the keys. Music that once brought solace now echoed hollow and incomplete. She wondered if Alexander hated her, if he believed, as he had said, that she had come to destroy him. Tears came easily in the darkness, and she let them fall, unseen by anyone but the ghosts of Whitmore Hall. Meanwhile, in the battered heart of Blackwood, Alexander prowled the corridors of his nearly empty house, tormented by regret. The estate's future grew more desperate by the week. Creditors sent letters daily, and Lady Blackwood's health faltered under the strain. Emily's questions about Eleanor were met with silence. One morning, as Alexander sorted through the stack of papers Eleanor had uncovered, a line caught his eye. He read it once, then again, heart-pounding. It was not only a matter of inheritance. There was a provision requiring the signatures of both parties involved in the old legal dispute. Without Eleanor's agreement, no claim could be made, and the estate would be lost. But if she cooperated, both their families might be saved. He hesitated, pride warring with desperation. To seek her help would mean lowering himself, admitting the depth of his need and the truth of his feelings. Yet the alternative was unthinkable. Ruin, disgrace, the loss of everything he had fought to preserve. By late afternoon, his mind was made up. He ordered his horse, donned his best coat, and set out for Whitmore Hall beneath a brooding sky. Eleanor was in the music room when word reached her that Lord Blackwood had arrived. The announcement sent a flurry through the household. Servants peered from behind curtains, and Mrs. Harrow whispered warnings about discretion and dignity. She stood when Alexander entered, every nerve taut with dread and longing. He looked travel-worn, rain streaking his hair, but his eyes were clear, determined. She spoke first, her voice barely steady. "Alexander, I did not expect—" He interrupted, words urgent but measured. "Forgive the intrusion. I would not have come had I any other choice." She gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing, pacing the length of the room. "There is a matter I must discuss with you," he said, refusing to meet her gaze. "The documents you found there is a provision that I overlooked. The trust can only be resolved if both families, yours and mine, act together. Without your signature, Blackwood Hall is lost." Eleanor's hands clenched in her skirts. "You came for my help," he nodded, pride straining in every muscle. "I have no right to ask it. After all I said, after all you endured, I do not deserve your mercy. But I must beg it, for Emily's sake, for my mother." She moved closer, searching his face. "You think I would refuse you? Alexander, I would never use the law against you. I never wanted that power. I only wanted—" She broke off, tears threatening. He looked at her then, his own voice raw. "I do not know what to believe. When I learned who you were, I thought you had come to destroy me. I let my pride blind me to everything else. But these weeks without you—" Eleanor's eyes filled with pain and hope. "These weeks have been agony. I did not choose my birth, but I chose you. I thought if I hid the truth, I might have a chance at happiness, even for a little while." He came to her, hesitation written in every step. "I cannot forget the hurt, but I cannot forget you either." A silence stretched between them, taut and fragile. She spoke at last, voice trembling. "You asked me once if I trusted you. I did, and I do, even now. But I was so frightened of losing myself, of losing you. All my life I have been pursued for what I own, not who I am." He reached for her hand, his touch tentative. "And I have been so consumed by duty, by the past, that I could not see the woman before me. I let anger and old wounds drive you away. I'm sorry, Eleanor. More sorry than I can say." She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "If you can forgive me, I will sign whatever is needed. I want only peace between our families. And if it is not too late—" He drew her gently to him, resting his forehead against hers. "It is not too late, if you still care for me." Her lips trembled. "I have never stopped." The door creaked, and Mrs. Harrow appeared, flustered. "Miss Whitmore, Lord Hastings is here to see you. Shall I—" Eleanor stepped back, voice clear. "Tell Lord Hastings I'm engaged in matters of family, and I will speak to him later." Mrs. Harrow withdrew, casting a meaningful glance at Alexander as she went. He smiled faintly. "The world will not make this easy." She managed a shaky laugh. "It never has. But I am tired of hiding." They sat together, side by side, at the pianoforte, their fingers touching lightly on the keys. The music was hesitant at first, then grew, confidence returning with every note. Outside, the storm began to break, the rain easing as sunlight filtered through the clouds. For the first time in weeks, hope flickered in Eleanor's heart, a hope that perhaps, together, they might yet find a way through pride, loss, and the tangled legacy that bound them. But as the echo of their confession faded, both knew the path forward would not be simple. Whitmore and Blackwood stood at a crossroads, and the world was watching. The next choice would change everything. A sharp spring wind swept the banners along the main avenue, carrying with it the faint scent of hyacinth and the more pungent aroma of change. In the heart of this restless season, Eleanor Whitmore and Alexander Blackwood stood side by side in the oak-paneled office of the family solicitor, papers spread before them, history and hope intertwined on every page. It had not been easy to reach this moment. News of their alliance, First whispered in drawing rooms, then shouted in scandalized parlors, had brought disapproval from every quarter. Lady Blackwood had refused to descend from her rooms for 2 days, and the Whitmore guardians had sent letter after letter, filled with warnings and veiled threats. Both families clung to grievances decades old, as if pride alone could mend what generations of rivalry had torn. But Eleanor and Alexander were no longer children of those feuds. Pain had taught them the limits of pride, and love had shown them the strength in vulnerability. So it was that they faced the daunting task of untangling the legal knot that had bound Blackwood and Whitmore for so many years. The negotiations began in awkward silence, the air heavy with mistrust. Mr. Ashcroft, acting for the Whitmores, eyed Alexander with professional wariness. Mr. Griggs, the Blackwood solicitor, responded with equal caution. Alexander broke the tension. "We do not come as adversaries, gentlemen. Miss Whitmore and I wish only for a fair settlement, one that restores dignity to both names." Eleanor nodded, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Our family's quarrel has cost us dearly. I have no desire to win at your expense, Mr. Griggs. I hope you will see that." It took days of careful review of deeds and codicils, of old correspondences and new promises. Eleanor pored over every detail, her sharp mind uncovering overlooked nuances and proposing solutions that surprised even the lawyers. Alexander's temper, once quick to flare, now burned with a patient resolve, his respect for Eleanor deepening with each negotiation. Between meetings, they walked the gardens of Whitmore Hall, their conversations quieter but richer. Alexander no longer saw Eleanor as a rival or a threat, but as the truest of allies. "You see possibilities where I saw only enemies," he told her, during one such stroll, the sunlight gilding his hair. "It is you who have taught me to hope again." She looked up at him, her smile tinged with relief. "And you have taught me that courage is not found in running away, but in standing one's ground." Society, meanwhile, looked on with a mixture of fascination and censure. The gossip in town was relentless. At the county assembly, Lady Blackwood was besieged by pointed remarks and thinly veiled insults. "Such a risk, Lady Blackwood," sneered Mrs. Finch, a matron known for her venom. "To trust a Whitmore under your roof after all these years." Lady Blackwood drew herself up, her tone icy. "Miss Whitmore has shown more integrity than most. And as for risk, I have always believed in facing the world head-on." Eleanor's own guardians fared little better. Mr. Fairfax pressed her daily, his disapproval poorly disguised. "You jeopardize your future, Eleanor. The Blackwoods are hardly a suitable match, even with the legal victory. And what of Lord Hastings?" Eleanor's answer was unwavering. "I choose a partner, not a prize. Alexander is my equal in spirit, if not in fortune." Despite the obstacles, progress was made. The critical point one buried in the oldest Blackwood deed provided that the disputed land, if managed jointly, could restore prosperity to both families. Eleanor proposed a partnership. Profits would be shared, the boundary lines redrawn, and a trust established for the next generation. Alexander embraced the plan, and together they persuaded their reluctant elders that unity, not division, was the only path forward. The final meeting was held in the drawing room at Whitmore Hall. The air buzzed with tension as Lady Blackwood, Alexander, Eleanor, and the Whitmore tutors gathered around the table. Mr. Ashcroft read the terms aloud, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged chamber. "Do both parties agree?" he concluded. Alexander's hand found Eleanor's beneath the table. "We do," he said, his voice clear and strong. Eleanor nodded. "We do." There was a moment's silence, broken only by the scratching of pens as signatures were set to paper. Lady Blackwood watched Eleanor closely, her eyes softening with a grudging admiration. Afterwards, as the tutors and solicitors departed, Lady Blackwood remained. She regarded Eleanor for a long moment. "You have done what none of us believed possible, Miss Whitmore. You have ended a feud that defined our lives. I do not pretend to approve of every choice, but I see now that Alexander is better with you at his side." Eleanor's response was quiet. "Thank you, my lady. I hope to justify your faith." Mr. Fairfax, too, offered a stilted nod. "You have conducted yourself with honor, Eleanor, Perhaps there is more to partnership than we believed. The transition was not without its difficulties. Some in the county would never accept the union. There were cold shoulders at dinners and more than one invitation rescinded. But for every loss, there was a quiet victory. Emily's laughter returning to Blackwood Hall, the first harvest from the newly unified lands, the growing trust between two once divided households. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of violet and gold, Alexander found Eleanor in the library, poring over estate ledgers. He leaned against the door, a smile in his voice. "You work harder than any steward I have known." She looked up, laughter in her eyes. "And you are less stubborn than you once were, my lord." He crossed the room and took her hands in his. "Eleanor, no, my love, these past weeks have shown me what it means to have a true companion. Not a prize, nor a pawn, but a partner. I trust you with my name, my land, my life." Her reply was soft but resolute. "And I trust you with my heart." In the hush that followed, they stood together, not as Blackwood and Whitmore, but as two souls forged by adversity and joined by choice. Outside, the world still gossiped, still doubted. But within the walls of Whitmore and Blackwood, respect and trust flourished, the wounds of the past healing at last. Yet even as peace settled over both estates, the future remained unwritten, full of promise, and the faintest whisper of new challenges still to come. Sunlight streamed through the arched windows of the small chapel on the edge of the Blackwood estate, gilding the pews and casting golden halos on the worn stone floor. There were no grand carriages lined along the drive, no throng of noble guests or parade of county gentry. Instead, the air was thick with quiet anticipation, scented with spring roses and the faint tang of hope renewed. In this sanctuary, Eleanor Whitmore and Alexander Blackwood stood before the altar, hands entwined, hearts steady, despite the murmurs of a world that still watched them with wary eyes. The ceremony was modest, attended only by family, a handful of loyal friends, and the staff who had weathered the storm of scandal and change at their sides. Lady Blackwood, her bearing as regal as ever, watched with a complicated pride from the front pew, while Mr. Fairfax and Mrs. Harrow sat together, their expressions softened by time and acceptance. And at the center of it all was Emily, radiant in a dress of blue muslin, clutching a posy of wildflowers and nearly bursting with happiness. The vicar's voice was warm and solemn. "Do you, Alexander, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to cherish and respect from this day forward?" Alexander looked into Eleanor's eyes, his voice unwavering. "I do." "And do you, Eleanor, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to honor and stand beside in fortune and adversity?" Eleanor's answer was quiet but filled the room. "I do." As the vows were spoken and rings exchanged, there was a hush, as if the very walls held their breath. When Alexander kissed his bride, it was not only a promise for themselves, but a pledge to lay old grievances to rest. Lady Blackwood dabbed her eyes, and even Mr. Fairfax allowed himself a rare, satisfied smile. Outside, Emily ran ahead of the newlyweds, scattering petals across the path. She seized Eleanor's hand, tugging her into a dance beneath the budding trees. "I have a sister now," she declared, her laughter ringing out like music. "You will never leave us again, will you?" Eleanor knelt, brushing a stray curl from Emily's brow. "Never, my darling. We are family now." The celebration that followed was simple but heartfelt. There were toasts in the garden, music and laughter among the flowering hedgerows, and a feast that brought together Blackwood and Whitmore retainers for the first time in living memory. The servants, once divided by suspicion, now mingled freely, their relief palpable as old resentments faded in the light of new beginnings. Alexander and Eleanor settled into the manor with a sense of purpose that surprised even themselves. The estate, long battered by years of mismanagement and uncertainty, became the focus of their united energies. Eleanor, undaunted by her new role, threw herself into the work of administration. She walked the fields with the steward, listened to the tenants' grievances, and insisted on fair wages and new tools. The tenants soon learned that the new Lady Blackwood was as formidable as she was compassionate. One afternoon, as the sun set over the golden fields, Alexander found Eleanor in the old estate office surrounded by maps and ledgers. You are working late again, he observed, a trace of amusement in his voice. Eleanor looked up, her eyes bright. There is so much to do. The new irrigation scheme is nearly ready, and I believe we can double the barley yield if we rotate the crops more efficiently. He smiled, pride and affection mingling in his gaze. I never imagined I would enjoy discussing crop rotations with my wife. She rose and crossed to him, slipping her hand into his. It is our land now, Alexander, our future. I want to make it flourish for Emily, for everyone who depends on us. He squeezed her hand gently. I am learning, Eleanor, that partnership means more than I ever understood. I'm grateful for your wisdom and your stubbornness. They stood together at the window, watching the last light fade, their silhouettes joined as one. Charity soon became another cornerstone of their union. Eleanor, drawing on her experiences both as heiress and governess, founded a small school on the estate for the tenants' children. She oversaw the purchase of medicines for the village infirmary and began a tradition of weekly gatherings where grievances could be aired and ideas shared without fear. Alexander, once content to let tradition rule, found himself invigorated by Eleanor's vision. He championed her causes, appearing at her side in the village square and defending her innovations before skeptical neighbors. Society watched all this with a mix of fascination and censure. Invitations to certain houses were slow to arrive, and at the county assembly there were whispers behind gloved hands. Did you hear the Blackwoods have allowed the tenants to dine at table? And the new Lady Blackwood gives lessons to their children herself, imagine! Yet, as months slipped by, the grumblings softened. The improved harvests, the thriving tenants, and the cheerful laughter at Blackwood Hall became impossible to ignore. Respect replaced suspicion, and gradually, admiration took root. At home, the marriage blossomed. Alexander discovered joy in the equality of their partnership, seeking Eleanor's counsel in all matters. Disagreements arose, of course, over the color of the new nursery, over how best to handle a stubborn tenant, or whether to allow Emily a puppy. But they were met with laughter and compromise, not rancor. In quiet moments, Eleanor would play the pianoforte while Alexander read, Emily curled between them with her books. One evening, Lady Blackwood joined them, her stern features softened by candlelight. She watched her son and daughter-in-law, her voice gentle. You have brought more peace to this house than I believed possible, Eleanor. I'm proud to call you my daughter. Eleanor smiled, her heart full. Thank you, my lady. That means more than you can know. The past, the feuds, the betrayals, the sorrow became only the foundation for a future forged in trust and love. No longer haunted by old wounds, Alexander and Eleanor looked forward, their alliance a beacon against the skepticism of the world. Together, they shaped their own destiny, proving that even in a world ruled by tradition and suspicion, love and respect could build something new and lasting. As summer came, Blackwood Hall was alive with possibility. The couple walked the fields at dusk, hand in hand, the horizon wide and open before them. Emily ran ahead, laughter echoing across the golden land, and behind her, Eleanor and Alexander followed partners, equals, and at last, truly home.